Welcome back to another Americans in Paris stream. I'm Stephen Heiner, and with me, as always, is my friend Molly Sebrier. Hi,
Hello.
Molly.
Hello.
So today we're going to be discussing a classic question, which really doesn't occur to you until you live in Paris.
Hmm.
You may sense it a little bit as a tourist, even if you're staying for a few weeks, maybe even a month. But you will definitely figure this out as a resident of Paris. And I should start the conversation by saying this is not a Paris thing, insofar as I lived in Kansas City before I moved to Paris. It's funnily enough, Mary Abali, do you know it's called the Paris of the Plains?
No, I didn't know that.
So Kansas City is called, and people would say like Steven's moving from the Paris of the Plains to the Paris of the Paris. Um, so Kansas City has a river which divides it actually in Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay.
But I lived down what was called down south, which was the suburbs. And we would refer to anything north of the river as simply that. So someone
Okay.
would say, oh, it's there. It's like, oh, well, that's north of the river, which meant
Mm.
basically that it might as well be in Antarctica. The only thing that's north of the river that matters is the airport. And
Okay.
people obviously go to the airport, but otherwise it's north of the river. And people who are north of the river, they say, oh, that's south of the river. So there's an imaginary line. Same thing I said is true in London. If you
Hmm.
talk to people who are dating, they would specify their dating profile. No one outside zones 2 or 3 or something like this. And zones in London refer to the tube.
Okay.
And let's say zone 10 is out in the boonies, Molly. So it
Yeah.
would be like one of your RERA stops for when you
Okay.
used to commute, right? So if someone
Hmm.
was in zone 10, they were undateable. Okay.
Okay.
And so it's not just and I would say it's true in New York City. Maybe Molly, you might have more experience with this than I do, but people will say, I won't date outside Manhattan or even certain streets in
Yeah.
Manhattan, or
Hmm.
I only date people in Brooklyn, or I won't date people outside Queens or whatever else. Or if you're in Queens, get off my list or whatever. Um, and this is just an expression of people being, I think, neighborhood focused. If they've been commuting for work, they don't necessarily think, you know what I want to do? I want to commute for my social time. I want to date via commuting. And also, too, I think it just happens that way. You then develop a tribal loyalty, and you say, oh, well, that's north of the river, or that's in zone 6, or wherever it is, and you exclude those as possibilities to your life.
Totally. And I think definitely, like you alluded to in New York, it's more of like the boroughs. But your Kansas City reference makes me think of my own reference, which I'm from Rhode Island, which anyone watching this, if you've ever been to Rhode Island, you can drive like north to south in like an hour and a half. And also like from east to west, it's like even shorter than that. And in southern Rhode Island, because again, if you know Rhode Island, you know that southern Rhode Island and northern Rhode Island are not the same at all. Northern Rhode Island is definitely more like Boston, I would say. Definitely much more like Italian American vibe. And there's this tower that is like on the edge of the town where I grew up. And I say tower, I don't even know how tall this thing is, but it's like this wooden structure that you climb to the top of it and you can see this beautiful like outlook. And everyone in the southern part of Rhode Island called South County, if you're in the know, but that's not an actual county in Rhode Island. And everyone down here, especially my dear mother, who, if she's watching this, shout out to my mom, she's got this phrase and it's this saying that everyone else says, like, I'm not going north of the tower. And when I say like not going north of the tower basically is like you're not going anywhere outside of like a 20-minute radius of like where she is from or where she lives. And it is true. I think it's like it's a convenience thing. And it also has kind of morphed into this thing that I kind of like mentioned, where like the northern part of Rhode Island is so different from the southern part of Rhode Island. And that kind of, I think, is a great transition into what we're talking about today, which the left bank and the right bank are very, very different. And I think, like, do you think a tourist would notice that, like, first visit, the
No, that's
difference?
why I'm saying I don't think they're
Yeah.
likely to know. Maybe even not. if they stay for 2 or 3 weeks, they might not even
Yeah.
notice, but they will notice if they're there for longer than a month.
Yes.
I
Yes.
want I wanted just before we transition, I want to pick up on your 20-minute thing because I find this number to be resonant around the world where I talk, where
Mm.
whether I'm in Singapore or in Armenia or wherever it might be, 15 to 20 minutes, and then you've heard this phrase 15-minute cities, where
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
idea is everything within a 15-minute radius is comfortable for most people. Now, in Paris, that's walking. In
Mhm.
in Rhode Island, it'd be driving. But
Mhm.
the time is still the same to people, whether they're driving or they're walking. The idea is I don't really want to go too far to live my life, right? And so those then become, you could say, fixed preferences, which then can become prejudices and preferences
Mhm.
over time, right? So I want to start on the left bank because between the two of us, you're the only one who's ever lived on the left bank, right?
Yes.
So tell
And
us about this faraway place.
I know. So I've definitely talked about it before. I'm pretty sure in our live Pitch Me, I Live in Paris, shout out. Because I lived on the left bank only once, and it was during my semester abroad. And it was, when I compare it to later years in Paris, it was definitely like my Vince is coming to mind, like action. Like it was like the Paris you see it in movies. And it was what made me fall in love with Paris. So I don't regret living there. And it is, where you'll find Café Flore de Mego and the Latin Quarter and La Sorbonne and the Luxembourg Gardens and this very, very picturesque area in Paris, the 5th and 6th arrondissement. But it's also very like, I guess, an insular sort of part of Paris where it's either French people who have lived there, for decades, their family has had an apartment there, or maybe even longer than decades, or it's a lot of American tourists or just other tourists in general, or it's a lot of students. So it doesn't really feel, it feels like a vacation from real life in many ways. It feels like the fairy book version of Paris. You're walking around, you stop at one cafe and write for a couple hours, and then you go to another cafe and you read your book and you're drinking your coffee the entire day. And
P.S. You'll be spending a lot on those coffees, by the way, on
like
that side.
4 times what you could get a coffee for in the 19th. But I think it's definitely worth exploring as a tourist or even as someone who lives in Paris. I think it is. There's a lot of history in those parts of the city, but again, it feels like the Paris you see in the movies, the not real life Paris. That's how I felt living there.
Sure, that's fair. And I can only comment as someone who has at best shown people apartments on the left bank
Mhm.
back
Mhm.
when I was doing that for a side gig. I loved, if you missed it, check out Molly's video. Maybe we can link to it after the stream in a card. But Molly did a great video recently on side hustles, she did
Yes.
to survive in Paris. And one of them that we did together was we showed apartments for different people in Paris who wanted to rent, particularly to expats. They found,
Mhm.
and this is a sort of hilarious story, which we'll talk about more when we do that video. But there are some French landlords who don't like renting to French people. They prefer
Yeah.
to rent to expats, and we could talk more about that in that video. But what Molly is saying, I think really when someone says left bank, I think 567. And
Yeah.
if people are not familiar, pull up a map, just Google online arrondissement of Paris, and you'll notice it goes in a snail shell in clockwise manner. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, cross the river, 5, 6, 7, cross the river all the way through 12, cross the river 13, 14, 15, cross the river 16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there is Ile de la Cité and Ile Saint Louis in the middle. And I
I
suppose,
was Yeah, I was actually wondering, like, what are
I,
those
I think I
considered?
think they're considered part of Parisian. So one,
Okay.
two, three, and four have now been consolidated administratively into Parisian, but everyone still refers to the arrondissement. So
Mhm.
so things change very slowly in France. But when I think about the left bank, I really think about 5, 6, 7. I
Yeah.
don't think about 13, 14, 15. Now, interestingly enough, I recently led a tour in Paris to a group of Americans over a 10-day period. And we stayed in an Airbnb in the 15th. And it was, I remember, telling the guests, I said, is it not as quiet as I told you it would be? It was like dead silence, starting
Yeah.
at like 9 o'clock at night, which, as it
Wow.
is in most outer arrondissement of Paris, people go to bed early on weekdays. That's just how the French are, particularly the Parisians. So 13, 14, 15 are just perfectly fine outer arrondissement.
Hmm.
There's nothing wrong with them. Obviously, the 15th is on the edge of where the Eiffel Tower is, so that probably has that going for it. And you are near other things. So d'Enfer Rochereau
Hmm.
has access to the catacombs and the Museum of the Liberation of Paris. So I'm not trying to pretend there's nothing going on in 13, 14, and 15, but no one says, you know what I want to do? I want to move there. And if you bring it up, this is what's funny, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. When you bring up your arrondissement in Paris, it says a lot about
Oh
you
yeah,
to your co-respondent.
for
So no one
sure.
ever goes, "Oh, I live in the 13th." People go, "Oh." Said no one ever,
I
right?
know.
Whereas I've been in Paris like 2 months, and I lived in the 17th for my first year and a half in Paris. And I didn't know what the reputation was. So this is month one, month two, Molly. People are like, "Where do you live?" And I was like, the 17th. And they go, "Oh." And it was funny because at the time, I didn't know what the reputation of the 17th was. In my mind, it was
Yeah.
just really quiet and clean.
Hmm.
And what I didn't realize is I learned over time, historically, it's one of the later arrondissements to be incorporated into Paris. So it was 200 years ago, that was farmland where the
Hmm.
17th is today, right? And so during the Haussmannian time, they started to build homes out there, and they had more room to build. So the houses are bigger and the streets are wider, you could say, in a
Yeah.
certain sense. So everyone was always saying, "Oh, 17th." And I was laughing because what? I lived in 6 square meters. Americans,
I
that's
know.
64 square feet. That was my apartment on the 8th floor with no elevator. And people were saying, "Oh," because
Same with
it's
me in
your
the 16th.
it was your, oh
Same,
man, 16th. They're like Molly has is Miss Moneybags. A
literally.
16th is where all the celebrities, all the embassies are in the 16th. So where you live in Paris, what arrondissement you live in says a lot about you. And so me, not only as someone who's only ever lived on the right bank, I am classically a right bank person. And what does it mean to be a right bank person? So let me try to articulate this a bit. Part of it is, I would say almost all of the action in Paris is going on in the right bank.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
isn't to say there isn't. We're all about leisure. Molly and I talk about this all the time. If you want to relax, there's the Luxembourg Gardens. If you want to
Yes.
study, there is the Sorbonne. There are all sorts of wonderful things going on the left bank. But the right bank is packed with things. So you have the Arc de
Mm.
Triomphe, you have the Champs Elysees, Montmartre, you have the 11th, you have the Promenade Plantée, you have everything that's going on that side. Now, obviously, you have the Louvre opposite from the Orsay, right down there towards the edge. But there's also more transport infrastructure. For whatever reason, there's more metro and bus lines. This isn't to
Yes.
say that, as I always say, the worst covered part of Paris means you're like a 5-minute walk from a bus or a metro station. That's the worst
Hmm.
covered part. And maybe on the right bank, you're maybe 2 minutes.
Yes.
It's planted thick with everything. So you have really ready access to get around wherever you need to on the right bank. All the, I would say, trendy restaurants. If you're a trendy restaurant person, if you like there's lots of the Parisians love trying the latest new thing.
Hmm.
There's lots of that on the right bank. Some really great farmers markets. I would argue probably the best farmers markets in Paris are on the right bank.
Hmm.
Or of course I would say that. But I would argue that's happenstance. So Molly, I don't think I've ever told you the story, but so I was living in the 17th, and I I was starting to get my big boy trousers on in my Paris journey. I thought, okay, I think I can afford a bigger apartment.
Hmm.
And the apartment I was looking at was a ground floor, one bedroom in the 15th.
Okay.
And it was a 5-minute walk from the church I attend. So I thought, easy, I get to mass on Sunday really easily. And so I put in my application. And the person said I liked it, let's talk about signing paperwork. some Colorado college kid's dad paid the whole year's rent in advance.
Mm.
And the guy asked if I could beat that. First of all, it is illegal
Yes.
to do this. But when you are new in France, you don't know what's legal or not. That's why I always joke when I would tell my French friends that I lived in 6 square meters, they would say that's illegal.
Yeah.
As if that
Yeah.
has any meaning for my real life. Like, it
I
doesn't
know.
matter that it's illegal. I still have to live there.
You're like, I had a place to rest my head. That's all I cared about.
Right. And so I then said, I'm not going to pay a year's rent in advance. It didn't occur to me, quote unquote, that's illegal. It's just like, well, I'm not going to pay your. And keep in mind, this is a college student, so she's not even going to stay there the whole year. The guy
Yeah.
just wanted to outbid me.
Yeah.
And so because of that, Molly, I didn't get that apartment in the 15th, which I was craving after living on the 8th floor. I thought this was going to be ground floor. My life is going to be awesome. I'll be just down the street from church. And how different might my life have been, Molly? We might still have met,
Mhm.
possibly, because of
Mhm.
how we met.
Yeah.
But how different might my life have been if I, and how my opinions have been if I like developed in the 15th, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Instead, where do I get an apartment? I get an apartment on Rue Saint Denis on the 5th floor of an old historic building, a 15-minute walk from the Louvre,
Mm.
right?
Also a very like quintessentially Parisian area.
Oh, 100%. And my
Mhm.
door, everyone would always admire my door. I just forget it was
Yeah.
this tall 20-foot carved wooden door. And every time someone would come to visit, I would rediscover that door because it would take their breath away. And I was just like,
Yeah.
I'm just putting in the code and pushing in the door. Like, you don't pay attention sometimes. And this is a trick I tell people to help refresh their ideas about Paris, is that don't allow yourself to get into a routine. You find yourself, walk commuting, invent quests for yourself. So today I'm going to look for things that are red, and you'll
Mhm.
find yourself looking for things. Or today I'm going to look for a particular type of plant, in a balcony, and
Yeah.
invent quests for yourself to help you keep discovering Paris and appreciating it and enjoying it. So, Molly, I move to the second arrondissement, pretty much the heart of the right bank, the inner right bank arrondissement, and I fall in love. I tell everybody the second arrondissement and my time there. I was there a couple, 2.5 years, 3 years.
Mm.
It was my favorite time in Paris. Just
Such
for
a cool street.
for various reasons. And you
Yeah.
were there numerous times, so you know the apartment
Yeah.
well.
And someone left us a comment saying I've become unintentionally super interested in everything France by watching this channel. Well, that's exactly why we're here. So thank you so much.
That's part of the conspiracy.
Yes. So it's so funny. I, imagining you living in the 50s is just, it's so quiet. It's so quiet. So I have a friend who lives there. And when she moved down there, she is someone who would always host like a Friendsgiving every year for Thanksgiving. And so that was like how I would celebrate Thanksgiving. Um, and the first time she had it in this new apartment, she was so excited to have us all over. She's like, I have so much space. Like, we're going to have this big, huge thing. And it took me an hour to get down there because, as you say, like the transportation down there is just so inconvenient. I'm pretty sure I was coming from the 18th down to the 15th, which is
Okay,
just,
so you're gonna what, go 4 or take 8 all the way down?
I would do 4 to 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean that's 45 minutes.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. Which
forever.
that's a long ride for Paris. Like, Paris is tiny.
And again, these are first world problems, right?
Of course.
Molly's you're gonna change once at Opera, and then you're just going down, so you
Yeah.
don't have that. But it's a long way down.
Bring a good book to read. And it's like you say, like you get out of the metro, and I think it was probably like a rendezvous for 8 p.m. or something like that, and like quiet, and it's November, right? So it's pitch black, and like you walk out of the metro, and you're kind of like, is this where I was supposed to be? But I also had that too when I was in the 16th, because although the 16th is not on is on the more lively bank, very residential area, very, very quiet. And it was one thing I loved about living there, like coming back home from a long day or a long night, and like the streets are just empty, and you feel very safe too. And um, I think if you are, watching this channel and you want to come to Paris with your family, if you've got young children, I think the 15th is a great place to raise a family. But if you're looking for convenience and a little bit more energy, I would definitely go a little bit more north.
And I think the challenge too is that, alluding to a dinner party, some people, especially if they live out of town, they will start to watch the clock as that dinner party
Yeah,
progresses and say, I've got to catch the last train.
exactly.
Because we haven't talked about this too much on the channel yet as far as transportation links, but the last RERA or RERB, lines wherever they're heading stop at a certain time. So that puts a crimp in your plans outside, because you have to get home. If you're inside the city, you have all kinds of options. You have night buses, you
Yeah.
have Uber, but less so. So your friends who came to your roomier place now have to leave slightly earlier because you're not as conveniently located.
Exactly.
So I said I'm unapologetically a right bank person, Molly. What do you feel you are?
It's so hard because I do have such like a place in my heart for the left bank. Honestly, only because of like things that I've kind of already cited, which is like it's like the home of the lost generation. Ernest Hemingway hung out
Shakespeare and companies
there.
over there.
Exactly. It's definitely, I guess, like the most like literary part of the city. And like I also just I hold like my semester abroad experience like so closely to my chest. So I feel like
No apologies.
I can't have that line in the sand like you do, where you're just like right banker bust. Like
Right. But I think it's because you actually have, right? So
yeah.
your lived experience is obviously more nuanced than mine. I'm obviously a
Hmm.
xenophobe of the right bank.
Yeah.
And I won't take any sort of left bank nonsense. Um, but I lead it to happenstance, Molly. I think probably this is something we should drive home to people in other parts of the world. And I think probably from our American experience for our American viewers, very often you can say, I want to live in this part of town, and then develop options around that and potentially do that.
Hmm.
That is not the case in Paris. You can have hopes,
Yes.
you can
Yes.
have desires,
Yes.
but the reality is you're going to get the apartment you get, buddy.
Especially as a foreigner.
Especially as a foreigner,
Yeah.
especially as someone who doesn't have a nice fat dossier with a
Yeah.
huge pay slip to basically open the door at any apartment you want to apply to.
Mhm.
And part of that too is sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you have to be the right profile of the
Yes.
person they're looking for. It's like, oh, you're a married couple. Well, we would prefer a single person. Oh, you have a cat. Oh, we're not really into cats. Now, hilariously, lots of French people are into cats, but
Oh, they love cats.
some landlords are not. Oh, you you come home late at night. Oh, okay, well, we can't have you. There's a lot more scrutiny put on. And so as your Paris life progresses, this might be self-selecting. If you live on the right bank and you have friends on the right bank, when you start putting out the feelers for another apartment, big surprise, your friends on the right bank will refer you to other people on the right bank, and
Yeah.
you end up getting the right bank apartment. And I
Mhm.
wonder if that's not how my journey was. 17th. Originally, I wanted to go to the 15th. I end up in the second. I then target the 19th, Molly, because that part of why I wanted that was that had a metro line that was very easily gotten to from my apartment the second, because at the time I was starting to add some Airbnbs, and
Mhm.
I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have this one, I'm going to keep this one as an Airbnb, I was going to do other things. And the that led me to be out there on the 19th. The big deviation obviously is I ended up moving out to the French countryside
Mhm.
a
I
few years ago,
know.
out
I
to
know.
Moret-sur-Loing, and Molly helped me move out there actually, in a reminder to how many books do you have, Stephen? And that was also a reminder to me that even though I now lived in the French countryside, I had very easy access to Paris. There is trains that go every half hour during regular hours, let's say between 6 and 6. You've got trains going every half hour, and then after that, maybe every hour, um, going into the city. So I had a bike. I would hang my bike on a hook. I'd then read, pray, whatever it might be, going into the city. 45 minutes later, I'm there. And then my old Paris habits would reassert, Molly.
Mhm.
So if you've been a right bank person, even if you don't live in Paris anymore, so I was out of Paris for 2 years, when I would come into the city, where would I go? All my favorite places on the right bank. You
Yeah.
develop these habits and you develop people that you depend on. My tailor,
Mhm.
my key maker, my shoe repair person. They were all in the second, very early on in my Paris journey. So even when I moved, so when I moved to the 19th, guess where I went to get my keys made? Guess where I went to get my shoes fixed? I
Mhm.
would go if I need something altered, I would go all the way into the second and
Mhm.
go down the street from where I used to live to the people I built relationships with 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Now, I did have when I was in Moy, I did have a cheese lady, I did have a butcher, etc. But I didn't make a new relationship with the tailor or the key person because I had one already, and I thought, oh, I can't. Keep
Yeah.
in mind, this is down the street, so I'm in
I
Moy in the
know.
countryside, and it's 20 feet away. It's like, but I already have a key maker, you know.
I know. I did the same thing with my hairdresser. My hairdresser is in Nanterre. Like, how many times am I going to talk about Nanterre on this channel? And I found her. I mean, back in the day, I was dyeing my hair blonde, which the ladies watching know. Like, once you find someone who knows how to do blonde, you like hold on to them for your dear life. And I think I randomly found them on like Instagram or something, and it must have been like, oh, she's in Nanterre, like we'll like suggest these people. I can't even remember, but even when I was living, I've lived out like in the suburbs of Paris on a couple different occasions, and so when I was living out in Nogent with my in-laws, that is like way across the city, like it's all on RERA, but I would get in on one end, cross the entire city, so the entire city of Paris, a couple like stops after Paris, and then I would get to Nanterre. And so I would honestly take the train for an hour, exactly like you, going from Moret into the second, just because I had this relationship with this hairdresser and I didn't want to find someone else. Like,
And hey, listen, when you find someone you trust, why risk that,
no,
And so
exactly.
it's worth the inconvenience. And I was always able to combine it. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm only going into Paris to get my keys done.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like, well, I'll combine this. And so happen the second for me, it's my favorite neighborhood in Paris, but I say that because I used to live there and
Mm-hmm.
I've developed an extreme familiarity. I can walk the streets of my old neighborhood, blindfolded. I know it intimately.
Yeah.
And so obviously you're going to develop a love and affection and you're going to say it's better than everything else, right? But and that's just how it is. If you go to any part of Paris, people will defend their quarter and they'll say, oh, my cheese lady is the best, or whatever it might be, our market's the best. And I love that.
Yeah.
Obviously no one is correct and everyone
I
is
know.
correct. you
Yes.
know
Yes.
what makes sense for you. I do want to you touched on it, so let's talk about it a little bit. The suburbs.
Yes.
So the number one reason a new person to Paris might pick the burbs is because it's much cheaper.
Yeah.
The minute that you leave Paris proper, so there's the périphérique, it's a ring road that goes around the city. I think prices drop 30%. Some
Yeah.
crazy number. And then if you go beyond the inner outer, so there's, for example, I'm thinking, Molly, of my neighborhood. So Le Lila and Bagnolet,
Yes.
just on the other side of where I used to live,
Mm-hmm.
I would say 30%. And then if you go beyond them, it go maybe 40%, 50%.
Mm-hmm. It's changing a little bit because they're like creating this Grand Paris, so they're
Right.
like trying to expand it. Because I the only reason I say that is because Nogent-sur-Marne, like where my in-laws live, which they're actually moving, but it's become just as expensive as
Sure. Well,
some.
and there's places that are desirable in and of themselves. I'm thinking of Montreuil,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
That's
mm-hmm.
sort of a trendy place to live. And you're like, but it's not even in the
Yes,
city. And then
yeah, yeah,
Montreuil people are like, what are you talking about, bro? Like, we're our own
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Like, don't
The
even
Brooklyn of France.
right. Like,
So
don't even
true.
mess around, right? Like,
Yeah,
Montreuil has their own cafes. They have their own
yeah.
brewery. They're like,
Total vibe.
we don't need no Paris, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
I have good
sometimes,
friends who lived in Montreuil. It's a really cool area.
sometimes people will want to live in those places. So as Molly alluded to, maybe that price differential isn't what it used to be. But the
Mm-hmm.
point is that would be, I would say, no one says, oh, I want to live near Paris.
Yeah,
Everyone always
yeah.
has the aspiration to live in Paris, but sometimes they will make that choice to say, I want a yard, or I want some peace and quiet, or I
Yeah.
want to be able to buy something I can afford. Whatever the reason is, that's what takes them out. The main disadvantage, obviously, is the commute.
Yeah.
and the limitations on your nightlife. You know, if it's getting to be midnight, 1 o'clock, you think, okay, I've got to make a move because I've got to catch that last train. And the where I was in my Paris life when I lived out in Molly, that didn't bother me at all. But perhaps a younger person, that might bother them a bit more. What else? What else do you think people should consider if they're living out in the burbs?
Well, it's so when I first moved to France, I was actually as an au pair. I was in one of the burbs outside of Paris, and exactly like what you just said, it was the reason why I ultimately ended up like wanting to leave that au pair position. Like I reflect on it sometimes, like with like the parents who I was working for, because if I could have stayed there with them, like up until right now, they would have still had me. And
Molly, like the 40-year-old au pair at some
I
point. It's
know,
like, Molly, at
I
some
know.
point, you got to move on with your life.
All the kids are 18 at this point. I'm just like still living in the basement. But I loved the kids so much, and I loved the family, and we had really just gotten to a groove after all those years. But the real reason why I wanted to leave was because I was just sick of that commute, and it wasn't awful. From my RER station, which it took me 15 minutes from the house to get to that station. So
Did you?
tack
So
on
you
that.
did you walk that?
I would walk. Sometimes I would take the bike. They had like a spare bicycle that sometimes I would borrow and then like just park it at the RER station. Like if I was towards the very end of my au pair stint, I had like an internship in Paris, and it was always kind of like cutting it a little bit close for me to get back to pick up the kids from school on time. So then I would take the bike. But then from my RER state stop to Châtelet was 20 minutes. So I could get to like Châtelet in
The largest
35
the largest
minutes.
metro interchange in the world.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I know. The amount of time that I've spent in Châtelet, it's
That's not
wild.
hyperbole, by the way, watchers and listeners. That is true. Châtelet is the largest metro interchange in the world.
I feel like I'm able to navigate it now, but like when I first got to Paris, it was a nightmare. So then I was only in Châtelet, so if I had to get
Where
anywhere
else?
outside of that area, it was kind of a hike. Um, but I mean, the lifestyle is totally different. I mean, the area I was living in when I was an au pair, you would never ever think it was a 20-minute metro ride away from the big city. And so I know that's why my au pair family loved it there so much. They had a beautiful home, a huge home, a beautiful backyard. The kids' school was like in the neighborhood. That's another thing that's kind of cool about the suburbs of Paris, in my experience at least. Like my au pair kids' elementary school was like 2 houses down. It's like, and it's much more convenient and well thought out, I would say. So again, like kind of like people, like I would suggest these people move to the 15th. Like if you're coming to Paris and you have multiple children and you want a lot of breathing room and you don't, having to catch the last train kind of early doesn't really bother you, I would encourage you to look into the suburbs. Because so on one side of the city, you've got like the Bois de Vincennes, which is like near where my in-laws live. And so my in-laws are able to walk to the Bois de Vincennes in like 10 minutes. And it's beautiful, beautiful area. And then on the other side of the city where I was living when I was an au pair is the Bois de Boulogne. And I also lived on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne when I lived in the 60s. So it really depends on your lifestyle. It really depends on your lifestyle. And I would say that too, and kind of like thinking about like left bank versus right bank. I think in the other part of the left bank that is really fun and cool if you are in this time in your life, like as a student, like everything is on the left bank. You never leave the left bank. All of the universities are over there, the student bars, the student cafes,
They
the
price
restaurants.
appropriately too. There's always student
Oh
specials and
yeah.
student pricing. Yeah.
Mhm.
All the movie theaters. You've got a ton of stuff over there.
But once I was done being a student and I still wanted to have like an active nightlife, then you're over in the right bank, going out in the 11th or going out in the 18th or going out, even in the 19th. There's some cool places to go out over there. But I kind of like this about Paris. Like she moves and grows and matures with you in whatever area of
And
life
vice
you're in.
versa. Vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. And so you can, spend your entire life in one city, but experience such different like moments, I guess, without having to go super, super far. And I feel like we've kind of like touched on this a little bit throughout this conversation, but Anne Hidalgo, like the mayor of Paris, which I know she has mixed people have mixed feelings about her. But one of the things that she is really passionate about doing in Paris is this idea of the 10, 15-minute city where you can stay in your same place, your same arrondissement, quartier, and your doctor is 5-minute walk away. Your grocery store, 5-minute walk away. Your best friend, 10-minute walk away. And she's trying to create, or not even create, I guess, like lean more into these little quarters and areas. And it really is because of that, thanks to that, that Paris feels like a village. And I feel like people say that all the time, and people are like, what do you mean Paris feels like a village? It's this huge city. But it really, like, because you've got the arrondissement, and then you've got within the arrondissement separate little areas within the arrondissement, and it's, yeah, I don't know.
No, you're making all the sense of the world, and I've got a lot of beef with Anne Hidalgo, but not on this, right? And also,
Yeah.
I give her a lot of credit for the bike progress that she made post COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Without her,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have the sort of bike city that we have now. But the reason why it's easier for her to do this project is because Paris was built that way.
Yeah.
Paris is medieval or even older, and that's how people used to live. They used to live within how far can I walk? How far can my horse go? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's how Paris developed. So it's not that hard to then encourage that when the infrastructure is already built for it. You're just
Mm-hmm.
making it even easier for people.
Mm-hmm.
So I very much believe in that. Now, Molly, people don't know this. Maybe they do, because I think you've talked about it in at least one of your videos, but we can't imagine that everyone watches every one of our videos. If you do, just put MVP in the chat of this video if you watch all of your
Yes.
videos, and we'll find like a treat to send your way. But Molly has lived on Ile Saint Louis, which, keep in mind, there's Ile de la Cité, which is the oldest part of Paris. That is where Paris began. That is the beating center part of head of the church and head of the state was on that island. Ile Saint Louis was created as an island of the island. So you want to talk about fancy town, Ile Saint
Mm-hmm.
Louis, and
Mm-hmm.
Molly lived there.
Do you mean when I was doing like Airbnb stuff with?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. Oh my gosh, what an amazing apartment! Oh my goodness, the coolest apartment in Paris I've ever been in. Like so cool that like the fireplaces were actually working, and they were like using the fireplaces to like burn a fire in like the winter time. It was so cool. Um, yeah, I've been in some really cool places in that area because I have a friend's parents who lived like near the Musée de la Monnaie, like which, so for anyone watching, it's like the center of Paris, and their living room window like overlooks the Seine, and that little, like, I think it's like Pont des Arts is over there.
Yeah, the Monet is right
Very
over by the Académie Française, like
exactly,
that part.
exactly. So I mean, it's again, it's very similar to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. You feel like you're living in a living museum. Like I think that's the perfect way to describe it. Is you feel like you're living in a living museum. And I think for like maybe because I spent so many of my early years in that area of Paris, that's why I feel this way. But it wasn't like so shocking and difficult for me to go from living and growing up in such a small town, moving to such a big city like Paris. Like I never felt this overwhelm or stress that one can feel in New York. And I think it's thanks to the fact that they are these little micro areas and neighborhoods that are so their own little ecosystem within themselves, that you don't have this feeling of overwhelm like I'm living in this city with millions of other people. You're like, oh no, I'm just living in this on this street with my neighbor down the street. You know what I mean? It feels so normal. But Ile Saint Louis is beautiful, beautiful. A really cool place to have a little picnic by the Seine is right under that like weeping willow tree, right over near the big statue of Saint Louis. Yes, of King Louis. But yes. one
Yeah,
of my classier moments.
and some of the more expensive ice cream that you're gonna buy in
Oh,
all of Paris is on that island as well. Don't
oh
stand in the
yes.
long lines, just find a time to go when it's not busy. But I had the great privilege, Molly, I have some lovely friends there on the island, and I've had a chance to house sit for them,
Oh,
and their apartment would look out onto the Seine as well. I would remember when I was house sitting, it'd be a Saturday morning, I'd get up, and I'd open the shutters, and I would feel like such a big deal.
yes.
And it was very, very dreamy, and a chance to look at what the other side was like. I've also one of my very first dinners in Paris was on Ile de la Cité with a friend from church who had an apartment there and with his family. And
Hmm.
I just thinking to myself, like, I was, I don't know, 400 feet from Notre Dame, and I'm having
Yeah,
dinner on
yeah.
Ile de la Cité. So those are very special places, very difficult. You want to talk about some of the most choice real estate in town, Ile Saint
Because
Louis,
once you
and
get that, why would you let
yeah,
go? I mean,
you're not gonna let go of it. But
yeah.
to point you said earlier about Paris getting you at different phases of your life, Vince and I were recording the other day, and I left his apartment around 5, which on a weekday this means everyone is out. Okay, no one is working late. That's just not something the French do. Like, oh, I just need to work for another hour. No, I'm gone.
Yeah.
I'm gone. And so the way I would describe this street scene was explosively vibrant. So
Hmm.
everyone's walking around. People are on terrace. You hear bing, ching ching of the bikes. Everyone's moving around, and I just thought, oh, Vince has got such a great neighborhood. Over by
Yeah.
Macadé. So
Yeah,
he's
I
over
love
by there.
that's my favorite place I've ever lived in Paris.
So such a great little neighborhood, but the tourists wouldn't know about it. And tourists, you don't have to know about all of the secret things, you could say, that the locals do. But it's just a reminder of all those different parts. I remember being obsessed with the canal for a while.
Oh,
So I would go down
me too.
to Canal Saint Martin, and I would go out of
Hmm.
my way. I'd be, not nearby. I'm like, hey, let's go hang out at Chez Prune or
Yeah.
wherever else. And I found this really great wine shop near La Camboge, and
Hmm.
I would go there obsessively. And it made me feel like Paris was my own because I
Yeah.
was making it my own. I had places I went to. I had things that I knew. And when my friends came to town, I would say, "Let me show you these places," which they wouldn't
Mm.
find on the tourist map. And that was a great joy, as I can show you Paris as a local, and I loved to do that. And that's part of those different phases of your life, right? And part of that is choosing when and where that can happen, and you do have some agency. It's when you weren't there that you can reflect. So when I was
Mhm.
in Moray, I was able to reflect. As far as being crowded, I will say the only time that I felt overwhelmed, and I am not somebody who is agoraphobic, I am fine with crowds, but post COVID, I could not believe how many people were on the street. I remember, and that isn't because
Mm.
I was afraid. I am not a mask person. I never was. That wasn't my concern. My concern was, I don't even say concern. I was just surprised. There were so many people out. And it was because I
Mm.
think, Molly, we had spent 2 years locked up.
Yeah.
So we weren't out. And then everyone decided we're going out. We're going out big. And I feel like
Mhm.
there was an overcompensation. Not only were all the Parisians out, but a bunch of tourists who had been waiting to come came out.
Yeah.
And that was the only time I think in my 10 years, let's say my 10-year Paris journey, that I felt like, there's a lot of people here. I need to escape out to the countryside. But otherwise, I would say it's more of what you talked about, where there are a lot of people here, but we're focused in neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember having those feelings too of being like, whoa, there's so many people. I feel like it was just we were all so used to. Well, I also think too, like when Paris opened back up, there was such like this feeling of joy, and like we were able to keep it for ourselves for some time. But then as soon as like they opened the country back up, so like tourists could come back in, like I just remember me and all my friends being like, no, like we don't want you here. It's so nice and calm,
Right.
so much less crowded. Um, but I do think, and if a New Yorker is watching this, maybe you'll correct me. In New York, I feel like, okay, yes, Times Square, is going to be like a madhouse, but I feel like you go outside of Times Square and there's still just so many people around. It's just there's so many more people there. Whereas in Paris, like, yes, the center of the city, it's going to be pretty crowded with tourists. Like all of them, if you don't know, all of the major monuments in Paris are along the Seine River. So that's where they all go. But I think it's like very easy in Paris to like go like a little bit outside of that very tight center, and you don't feel like you're in this big like tourist trap. Like it's so easy to find quiet moments.
I mean, I'm also happy to be corrected by New Yorkers, but I have a moment tied to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I was visiting the Whole Foods, one of the Whole Foods on Manhattan, with a friend, and I was just there's so many people in my mind,
Yeah.
and I said, "Is something going on?" And she said, "Steven, it's Tuesday." And in my head, I just thought I would only see this level of activity if it were very busy.
Yeah.
But it's Manhattan.
Yeah.
That's how it is. And I remember just laughing to myself that, wow, I'm such a rube. I don't really get it. I would have had that experience at the Monoprix by my house at 6 p.m. maybe,
Okay.
where
Yeah.
you have a lot, but it still wouldn't feel like how it would feel at that New York Whole Foods. So I think you're right that it's really hard to get to that level of busyness and overwhelm. I think of the times I've been in the tube in London and I've come out and we're literally stopped on the platform and we're moving slowly to the exit.
Mm-hmm.
I can maybe count a handful of times that was even remotely the case, and it was never to that extent. That happens routinely in London. There are so many people in London, so many people. And that's one of the things that people don't realize is, yes, there are 2 million people in the city, but because it's such an old city, people have lived there for so long. It's a place that people have managed to live without feeling overwhelmed. Whereas New York City is these huge buildings, and then they've told everybody, you will live here in these buildings, and we're going to force the infrastructure to work. Paris never did that. And so that's why I think it doesn't feel overwhelming. But what New York and what London, Shanghai, Hong Kong, these other places have done is you're putting a bunch of people into these locations. They didn't organically develop there. And as such, it can feel overwhelming. And I would say for some people, very stressful.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on the time for our stream. If there are any people in the chat who would like to ask us questions or share some thoughts, we're happy to. And obviously, if you're watching this after the stream, please leave comments in the comment section. Molly and I would love to have the conversation keep going with you. Any final thoughts, Molly? Any things you want to leave our watchers with?
Well, I feel like this is kind of like a good preview video, or maybe I would say an intro video before we start digging more deeply into like each neighborhood, each arrondissement. We have a ongoing series up on the blog where we call it our Paris neighborhood guide, and we're getting pretty good. We don't have too many arrondissements left that we need to do.
I have a bunch I have to do still.
You need to do your 19th one, but I feel like I'm really excited to dig even more deeply into what each arrondissement has to offer. Like I honestly could definitely spend an hour just talking about the 18th, and I guess kind of like to tie a bow on this, like right bank versus left bank, two totally different places, and you just got to spend enough time in each one to decide which one's the best place for you.
I agree with Molly. I'm just smiling because I'm thinking there are times when I either ruled someone out or someone else ruled me out because of dating. It's like, oh, but I remember her name was Claire. It was maybe my second year in Paris. And she's like, oh, Steven, it was our second date. She's like, you're really nice, but you live in the 17th. And I remember her saying that. And I just thought, is this for real? Is this, she's just trying to be nice? But only years later did I realize, because when I told someone like, oh, I'm sorry, you're in the 14th, I said, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
That I just didn't, just sort of the commuting and meeting people. And so it can shape your life, and it can shape your friendships and where you work and things like that. But in a sense, don't take it too seriously. I am saying I'm a right bank person and, right bank forever. But I could have very well been a left bank person. Who knows?
Yeah, you're not going to burst into flames if you cross the river.
Right. And in fact, let me remind you to be adventurous. That's one of the things I think that helped me to know and love the city as much as I did and do, is
Mm.
I really was adventurous. I would go down to the catacombs, or would go to one of the challenges is French people are, and Parisians particularly, are not adventurous enough about their own city. So they get
Mm.
into their own rhythms, and then they only
Mhm.
see stuff if their tourist friends want to see them.
Totally.
The number of times like someone's like, "Oh, I've never been in the Eiffel Tower." They were born in Paris,
Mhm.
or I've never been to the catacombs. They were born in Paris.
My
So,
father-in-law jokes with me all the time that I know Paris better than he does, and he was literally born in Paris.
but that's a wonderful thing about being the outsider, the alien. When I go to Singapore, which I do fairly frequently, my relatives always joke that they know they're going to go do stuff for the first time with me, or stuff that they haven't done their whole, like my uncle who's in his 60s or 70s now. I remember one visit, he went to the zoo for the first time. And the Singapore Zoo is regionally known, internationally known actually.
Okay,
But he was
yeah.
just never like, I'm gonna go. But it's like, okay, we're gonna go. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go with you.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid of being that opportunity for your local friends, to do that. And locals, make sure that you're exploring the city enough that you can take your tourist friends on some fun trips. So,
Yes, yes. We've got one more comment here. The idea of a huge city feeling like a village is really cool. I lived in 3 American cities, 2 of them top 10 cities, and have never had the feeling of a village in the slightest. Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I've
so
never lived in a big city in the United States either. Stephen has.
yeah, so St. Louis, which I've widely told people that if I were to ever leave France, that would be one of the first places that I would consider living in America. They have, but that's because that again goes back. A, it's a French city.
Mhm.
B, it dates back to the 1600s. So go back in time and technology, and the way that the city is laid out and the way that things are put together will make it more susceptible to that. So, for example, in St. Louis, you have Soulard, you have the Central West End, you have different parts of the city where it does feel like a neighborhood. Now, is it fully sustainable in the sense of I can get my grocery shopping and my doctor, and maybe, possibly, I
Mm.
would say it's borderline. I lived in Lafayette Square, which is the largest collection of Victorian homes west of the Mississippi. Put that in your
Mm.
trivia box. But really wonderful, beautiful neighborhood. And it did have, let's say, a collection of things, and it would feel maybe like a small French town in a way. But to the point of the person in the chat, I do think, especially if you go west of the Mississippi, the reason this is harder to find is because those developed after the railroad and after cars and streetcars, and the way that those cities developed was less sustainable. It built into this model of suburbs, whereas cities in the east, even near where Molly's family's from and where she grew up, you have, for example, Boston. There are
Mm.
there are parts of Boston that are like that. There, and I would argue, Molly, I'm thinking about the T right now and how that's laid
Mhm.
out. There are parts of that T line where people are like, "Well, I'm not going to go there.
Oh yeah, I
That's
mean
like 10 stops away."
the
And
tea sucks.
right, and so they can have that. And so I would just say, depending on where you are, it could be possible, but it's not going to ever be as easy as it is in Europe.
I'm thinking of like, so I have friends who live in the north end of Boston. That is a definite like real, I guess, like
Or the South
European,
End, or the
the
South
South
End of
End,
Boston.
yeah. But I do know they also will like, leave that area to go do certain errands and stuff like that. So it's not exactly the same. But so
All
yeah.
right. Well, we will wrap up for today. Thanks for joining us. And as I said, feel free to keep the conversation going in the comments. And until next time, à bientôt.
À bientôt. Thank you.